Whether you've gotten sweaty palms during a job interview or a nervous stomach before a date, we've all experienced anxiety. And though it's often talked about as one umbrella term for all of our anxious feelings, Resh Gupta, a cognitive neuroscientist, says that there are many different forms of anxiety.
So we all have some trait or dispositional level of anxiety, no matter who we are, what our experiences are. For some people, that trait level of anxiety is higher than for others. But this is going to be a general tendency of just how anxious you tend to be normally.
In addition to being a trait we all possess, anxiety can also be a state of being. Gupta is a postdoctoral research associate at Washington University in St. Louis. She works in the mindfulness science and practice cluster and the cognitive control and psychopathology laboratory. Gupta theorizes that it's important to understand the different types of anxiety in order to find the best treatments.
Anxiety is something we all experience, but it manifests in many different ways, with symptoms ranging from worry and hypervigilance to sweaty palms, muscle tension, and dizziness. So in the field of cognitive neuroscience, we've been really trying to understand what are the mechanisms or the processes that are responsible for these symptoms. Because if we can understand the mechanisms or the processes that are responsible for these symptoms, we can target them with some kind of treatment that can hopefully improve the symptoms.
One of the first steps to detangling this web is to look at how anxiety affects our brain. Gupta says that it reduces our cognitive control, which is the ability to regulate our thoughts and actions in order to achieve a goal. For example, if we want to get groceries after work, we'll turn down a dinner invitation because we're able to remember that we have to go to the supermarket during that time. But when we're feeling anxious, that ability to stay focused on our goals is drastically reduced.
Anxiety has been shown to worsen cognitive control by impairing the brain's working memory system, which is where your goals are stored. So, for example, if we think about anxiety, it's associated with a lot of worry. And worry occupies a lot of space in your working memory system. And that doesn't leave much room for your goals to be stored.
It turns out that practicing mindfulness improves this cognitive control, which led Gupta to the conclusion that she could use mindfulness as a method to reduce anxiety. The idea is if your brain is able to focus on its goals, it doesn't leave much room for worried, distracting thoughts.
But the problem is, despite the fact that that sounds theoretically very sound, the research was all over the place when we looked for support of that potential, what we call a mechanistic model. So basically understanding how mindfulness improves anxiety. We're saying it's through an improvement in cognitive control. The literature was all over the place, we posited, because anxiety, mindfulness, and cognitive control are not unitary. They're not one thing. They can be conceptualized in many different ways, and they can be broken down in many different ways. And so if you don't control for that fact, of course the literature is going to be all over the place.
Just like how anxiety can take on many different forms, like being a fleeting emotion or a foundational personality trait, mindfulness can also be broken down into similar categories.
When we think of mindfulness, we often first think of a mindfulness course, an 8-week intervention such as mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based stress reduction. So these are becoming very popular now for treating things like anxiety, depression, and stress. But mindfulness is also a trait that we all have. We all have some dispositional level of mindfulness. So maybe I'm more mindful or less mindful than someone else in general. And similarly to anxiety, mindfulness is also a state. So we can be more mindful in one moment compared to another, depending on what's going on.
It can also be a learned skill, which is good news for people like Gupta who want to use this to combat anxiety. As you may have guessed, the same is true for cognitive control. There are many theories breaking down how it works, but Gupta's lab works under the idea that cognitive control can be divided into two main functions, proactive and reactive control. She says that the proactive control is that same example of needing to go to the grocery store after work and keeping that goal in mind all day, deflecting anything that would get in the way.
On the other hand, we have a different kind of cognitive control called reactive control. So in reactive control, let's take the grocery store example again. This time in the morning, I say, I have to go to the grocery store after work, but I don't keep that information in my mind. I get really occupied throughout the day. My colleague asks if I want to meet. I'm like, sure, let's meet. And then I get to my car at the end of the workday and I see my grocery store list on the dash. And I say, oh, I have to go to the grocery store. So I'm able to go still and get it done, but maybe not as early as I wanted to, or maybe in not a planned fashion. But I still got it done. I was still able to carry out my goal.
Gupta says that both functions are important because it would be nearly impossible to stay aware of everything we need to do all day long. So instead of taking up so much mental space, we rely on both forms of cognitive control. By showing how anxiety, mindfulness, and cognitive control are all multidimensional, Gupta makes the argument that the current one-size-fits-all treatment approach is extremely inadequate. Instead, we need to figure out which types of mindfulness match to specific forms of anxiety. But after seeing how so many research papers have competing conclusions from studying these factors as one idea, Gupta realized that there needed to be a whole new framework for how this theory can be studied. She outlines this novel method in a recent paper published in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews. It proposes two theoretical claims that link specific types of anxiety with specific failings in cognitive control, then recommends a precise kind of mindfulness practice to help.
So in the first, we talk about a type of anxiety called anxious apprehension. And this type of anxiety is really focused on worrying. So in anxious apprehension, there's a lot of worry and repetitive negative thinking.
Gupta says this type of anxiety takes up a lot of space in our working memory that we need to keep our goals in mind.
We propose that there's a type of mindfulness practice called focused attention that's very well suited to mitigating these problems with this proactive control deficit, right? Keeping the goals in mind for people who are worrying a lot. So in focused attention practice, what we do is we have people focus on an anchor, such as their breath or a sound. And they keep bringing their attention back to that anchor every time the mind wanders. And so in this way, instead of focusing on the worry, you're focusing on the present moment experience.
The idea is that this type of mindfulness reduces your ability to focus on your worries and recenters you in the present moment. This allows you to regain good cognitive control and leaves no room for your anxiety to flourish. The second theoretical scenario focuses on a different kind of anxiety, called anxious arousal, which involves someone being hypervigilant of their surroundings.
People who are very high on anxious arousal are essentially very easily captured by things in the environment that are potentially threatening. They're also experiencing a lot of somatic or bodily anxiety, such as the sweaty palms and the heart racing and the dizziness, muscle tension. So in this case, we say that there's too much reactive control because the attention is so easily captured by things in the environment.
It's just like how seeing a grocery list jogs your memory of needing to go to the store, except now you're highly sensitive and making that type of connection with everything around you. In this case, Gupta believes a mindfulness practice called open monitoring would be most helpful.
In open monitoring, instead of focusing on one anchor, such as the breath or sound, we instead have people focus on the whole present moment experience, internal and external. So basically, you just focus on experiences arising and passing, coming into and out of your awareness. And you're just non-judgmental toward these experiences. So hopefully this is going to help these people with anxious arousal and too much reactive control become less hypervigilant to what's happening in the environment.
Gupta says this type of mindfulness isn't about changing your situation, but rather changing your attitude towards the situation.
It's going to help you to develop that attitude of curiosity rather than hypervigilance and fear toward everything that's happening, and developing a feeling of, okay, I'm safe in this present moment right now. And these are just thoughts. Thoughts are just thoughts. They aren't necessarily reflective of reality. So teaching individuals who have arousal to have this kind of mindset, which takes time to develop, will then help them to engage in this practice and develop the skills to see the experience in a different way. Because I always say with mindfulness, it's not about changing the experience, it's changing your relationship to the experience.
So far, Gupta's paper has been well received, with her peers acknowledging this could be a much more precise method for research.
Most of what I've received thus far has been positive in terms of feedback because we are trying to move away from a one-size-fits-all approach to treating anxiety to a more precision-focused approach where we match anxiety sufferers to the most appropriate treatments, whether it's a mindfulness practice or otherwise. And so I think that the field has been plagued by these one-size-fits-all approaches and assuming that something that works for a whole group will work for any given individual in the group. For example, when we do studies looking at the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral therapy or a drug, for example, an SSRI or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, every individual who's experiencing some sort of mental health concern has a diverse presentation of symptoms. And so really, I think people are responding well to this work because it's acknowledging the fact that if we don't match the right dimensions of anxiety to the right types of treatments, we're likely just using a hit or miss kind of approach.
Gupta's next step is testing out these theoretical claims and matching up the correct mindfulness treatments for different types of anxiety. You can find more information about Resh Gupta and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.